Since 2007, human feet have washed ashore along the eerie coastlines of the Salish Sea. With no signs of struggle and no clear pattern, the discovery sparked wild theories. As more feet continue to appear, the sea keeps its secrets and the mystery deepens. Hear more about this over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, all linked down below. My name is Joseph, and I'm from Austria. Many years ago, I went on a long-awaited dream holiday to Paris, France. I had always wanted to see the Eiffel Tower, walk along the Rue de Faubourg Saint-Honor, explore the catacombs, and visit Notre Dame Cathedral. It's such a tragedy what happened to that. But I finally saved up enough money to take the time off from my job as a chef and surprise my girl with a trip to the City of Love. We drove there from our home country of Austria and had a nice road trip on the way, staying at various locations and making many happy memories. Then we reached Gay Paris. It really was the most romantic city. We dined under the shadow of the Eiffel Tower and the twinkling city lights. We took long walks along the Seine and made love in our hotel room with the windows open to the late-night city. Apologies if this is not appropriate to share, but we Europeans are just sort of a free people who are not ashamed of our love for beautiful women. It was perhaps our fourth day in Paris, when myself and my lover Amelia were seated in a cafe awaiting our latest delectable taste of French cuisine. I had parked our car on the street outside. There was a parking space next to it, and I thought nothing of it, as the average car would be able to fit in there. A man came driving along and idled beside the space. The movement caught my eye, and I watched him with some curiosity, as I am always interested to see how other people maneuver into parking spaces. I forget the brand of car that this man had, but it was clearly too big for him. He did not possess the necessary skill to navigate into the parking space. Instead of giving up and moving on, however, he began to use his vehicle to shunt the cars on either side of the space in order to widen the gap. My car included, of course. Shunting a parked car like that can shatter the steering column or the axles, and this absolute Oslok was going hog wild doing it to my car and that of the hapless stranger parked adjacent to me. Naturally, I rushed out of the cafe and into the street. I yelled at him, in German, forgetting myself for a moment, and he pulled his car to a stop, pushed against mine, and climbed out. This man was a burly, dirty-looking dock worker type who fit every stereotype of the rough and vulgar Frenchman that I'd ever seen growing up. Nothing like the actual people that I'd encountered in Paris thus far, I might add. I could tell that he didn't understand a word that I was saying to him in German, but my French is pretty merda, so I tried English. I told him that he would damage my car and the neighboring car and his own car too, and to stop being a dep and go and park somewhere else if he wasn't able to fit his stupid vehicle in the space. And the man called me a filthy Spanish pig, and then told me to go back to Spain. I raised an eyebrow at him and called him a slur that I probably shouldn't have said, a very rude word in Austrian that sounds a little like foot but means something very different. And this was a big mistake because apparently he understood enough to know what I was insulting him with. And this burly man almost leaped over the hood of his car and came running towards me. He jabbed one huge finger right into my chest, almost knocking me backwards as he did so. I really hoped that Amelia would stay in the cafe and not draw attention to the fact that she was with me. Now this road rage Frenchman began to yell at me, and spit was flying from his lips. Now in English, I asked him to politely back off, but instead, he grabbed me and pushed me up against the wall. He put one fist next to my head in a clearly threatening gesture and began screaming right into my face. In that moment, I understood why they become road rage incidents, because I felt the anger burning inside me too. How dare this boorish man yell at me and get spit in my face? I was a visitor to his city. Besides, he was the one who had repeatedly shunted that car like some moronic bull. So I said this to him, trying my best to seem angry and threatening, and then shoved him backwards to get him off of me. Now this was a huge mistake. The Frenchman barely budged, and then sneered at me and started laughing. He drew his fist back, ready to clock me in the jaw. I ducked, and then he punched the granite wall behind me. Now, no sooner had he started to howl that I delivered a kick to his nether regions and ducked under his arm. Now, I probably should have kicked him harder because it did absolutely nothing to slow the enraged Frenchman driver down. He reached out to grab me, and I could see actual murder in his eyes. He was snarling and frothing like some kind of drunken animal, and I'm sure he was indeed plastered even though it was only 3 in the afternoon. My moment of confidence was over. I bolted, running from that angry driver down the street calling for help. Paris, which had once seemed such a romantic and wonderful place, now seemed hostile and uninviting to me. Passers-by looked on with just blank dismissal as I thundered down the sidewalk, my lumbering aggressor behind me. Thankfully, I was fitter, healthier, and smarter than him. I darted through a crowd, then across a courtyard, and eventually found myself looking at the Louvre Pyramid. An art gallery and museum seemed like the perfect place to lose a man such as this, so I darted past the glass structure, ducked into a building, and quickly found a public toilet. I hid in there and called Amelia on my cell and asked her to keep an eye out for the guy. She told me she was still in the cafe and that the police had been called, and the man's car was being clamped and towed. I stayed in the line with her as she described the next scene. The angry driver returned to his car and saw officers milling around the vehicle. I suppose in his drunken stupor, he mistook one of the officers for me and began to grab him, and then got forcibly thrown to the ground and subdued with batons. Amelia described it to me as I cowered in the bathroom, and I have never been more grateful in my life to miss out on something. The man and his car were carted away, and I have no idea what became of him, and I really don't care to know. Thankfully, our car was undamaged and we enjoyed the rest of our trip to Paris, but I have never trusted French drivers to park their cars properly to this day. A few years ago, I went on vacation from the States to Eastern Europe. Now, I don't want to say exactly which country I went to, because it was most definitely wonderful and I don't want to give it a bad name. I did a lot of traveling around the country, and while most of the places I visited were great, with awesome people and some pretty sick food, just an awesome time in general, there were a couple of joints that were absolutely seedy as hell. One of them was a town I'll just call Hellville. I stayed here for a week when I was backpacking, and I was meeting a female friend a week later and planned to spend a bunch of time with her. So for now, I was just kicking back and exploring this little town of Hellville that I found en route to her digs. I could tell that it was a sketchy place as soon as I hopped off the bus into town. It had a vibe kind of like Eli Roth's Hostel, and my dumb self found that pretty exciting. I'd joked the whole time before my vacation that I was going to stumble across some backwoods village where the locals kidnapped tourists for the entertainment of rich sickos, and I was almost excited by the fact that this place looked like it had potential. Yes, I know that I was, and am, an idiot. The first night, I got way too drunk in the local Hellville dive bar and almost got into a fight with a Chechnyan ex-military guy until we realized it was a big misunderstanding and ended up dancing and singing through the streets. Matthias became a good buddy then, and we exchanged cell phone numbers. He was backpacking through Europe too, and in our drunken stupor, we worked out that our routes would intersect a bunch more times, so we should look each other up. Feeling good for making a new friend, especially a badass Czech former soldier, I collapsed into bed in my hostel, being snapped at to shut the F up by more than one angry traveler. The next day, I went exploring Hellville. There wasn't really much to explore, just a few unhygienic-looking bars and cafes, a central square with an honest-to-God village well in it, which I was certain would give me cholera, and then a bunch of farmland. I took a stroll through the countryside to see if I could find any of those classic European milkmaids hard at work in the fields. Sadly not, but I did spy a few gruff-looking farmers and a group of teens in tracksuits that I didn't really like the look of. They were sitting on a fence, chattering in their language, and I could tell that they were talking about me because they were pointing at me and then whispering to each other and laughing. Despite being my arrogant self, I decided to make like a tree and split. I tried to look as casual as possible, but quickly broke into a jog. Now my heart sank as I heard footsteps and the sound of teenage voices behind me. A couple of them sprinted ahead to catch up with me and stood blocking my route back into town. There must have been 5 or 6 guys in total, 4 eventually facing me and then 2 big meatheads blocking off the return path. One of them pointed to my shoes and said something about trainers. I didn't understand for a moment, and then he muttered something about Nikes and then sneakers. I remembered Europeans referred to sneakers as trainers and then realized that he was saying that he liked my Nikes. I said back, yeah, that they were nice sneakers, but very cheap ones. Now this was true, they were probably only $100, nothing to get excited about. This caused the teens to start laughing cruelly, and then the obvious ringleader pointed at my shoes again and referenced that "damn Daniel" meme from years ago. I politely laughed, and he began to shove me, saying something in his language that I didn't understand. I could tell from his body language that he was asking why I was laughing at him though, which I'm sorry, but I thought that that's what you're supposed to do when someone says a meme, even if it's an ancient dead one. I had no idea how to convey it to this guy though, who clearly just wanted to start trouble with me. His buddy, a fat pig-looking guy with a Michael Cera bum-fluff mustache, also pointed at my shoes and told me to take them off in some broken English. Now, under no circumstances was I gonna give these a-holes my sneakers. They might have been cheap Nikes, but they were mine, and they served me pretty well on my backpacking trip so far. I told them to F off, and then realized that this might not be a good idea when there were 6 of them and 1 of me. I turned to leave and realized that one of the bigger guys blocking my path was actually carrying a knife. Now, it was only a Swiss Army knife and looked rusty as hell, but I didn't really like my chances of survival if that thing went into my gut. I was surrounded on both sides, so I did the one thing they hadn't counted on. I leaped the fence to my right and began to sprint across the fields like I was back in high school track. These teens started yelling and shouting, and I heard a crash from behind me as they leaped and toppled over the fence. One of them, probably the fat kid, had fallen to the ground and tripped a couple of more of them up. I continued to sprint, glancing over my shoulder, and saw that 3 of them were still following, including the leader and the one with the knife. Now, this knife guy wasn't that fast, but the leader was leaping over ditches and all sorts of stuff and clearly knew the land better than I did, so he was gaining on me. I kept running, looking for help of some kind, any kind. Did they even have cops patrolling the streets here? I certainly hadn't seen any kind of law enforcement. Hell, I'd take a miserable-looking farmer at this point. Surely these teens wouldn't stab me to death for my sneakers in front of the villagers. I had no idea what the place might be like, though. My mind went back to how I'd joked about looking for a town like in the movie Hostel, and I cursed myself for being such an idiot. I wasn't even going to die in a cool way by having my eyes cut out or my wiener fed to dogs or anything. I was going to get murdered in the middle of some ass-backwards nowhere place just because these kids wanted my $100 sneakers. Hell no, I thought. I doubled my efforts and leaped across the fields, vaulting a fence or 2 in order to escape my pursuers. A stone whistled past my head, and then another, and I realized the teens had stopped to scoop up projectiles at some point, and I was now in serious danger of getting my skull cracked as well as a knife between my ribs probably. A voice in the back of my head told me that maybe I should just hand the sneakers over, but my ego wouldn't allow it. Instead, I managed to run to the village. The first place I thought to go was the local bar, and thank all that is holy, my ex-military pal Matthias was actually sitting at the bar, just nursing a Coca-Cola or something and chatting to the barkeep. Now, I quickly ran up to him and told him that the kids were trying to kill me. He started laughing, patted me on the back, and said that he was sure that I could look after myself. And for some reason, he thought that I meant little children were trying to kill me. And I frantically insisted that no, it was a gang of late teens, one of them had a knife, and they were also throwing rocks. And the door burst open, and the 3 pursuers came in. The bartender said something in her language that I could tell was probably derogatory, and the ringleader of these youths snapped something back. Matthias jumped to his feet, knocking a stool over, and stood towering over even the biggest of the 3 teens. In that moment, I saw F around and find out playing out in real time. Matthias reached around the back of his belt and produced a small bag, which I realized was some kind of military-looking club. He slapped it against his palm and stepped forward. The kids froze, unsure whether to size up to Matthias or run. In the end, the bartender made the decision for them. He stepped out from the back room, shotgun in hand, and pumped it and pointed it at them. The boys started frantically apologizing, and the barman yelled something that I later found out meant, "I'm going to tell your fathers and you'll be getting the beating of a lifetime." Matthias and the barman explained to me that American sneakers are a valuable commodity to the teenagers in that country, and I should probably wear older, crappier-looking shoes if I'm going to travel around there. And Matthias even promised to hook me up with a pair of his army boots, which later he did. Now, they were 3 sizes too big for me, but I wore them with pride and still own them to this day. That night, Matthias and the barman treated me to a few drinks, and Matthias regaled me with some tales from when he was in the military. And all I can say is that I'm glad he and I did not get into a fight the night before, and I'm almost happy for the teens that they backed down when they did. Man, Matthias can be scary at times, and I'm still in touch with him to this day via email sporadically. He travels Europe like some kind of Jack Reacher drifter, only without the wild adventures, but I like to think that if he needed to throw down, he would. Now, I moved on from Hellville the next day and went to visit my female friend early. I was not sad to be out of that village, and looking back, I cannot believe how dumb I was to fight for my life instead of just handing over those damn sneakers. But on the other hand, they were nice sneakers and I paid for them with my own money. No deranged European kids get to steal my shoes. Firstly, I want to begin this story by saying that I do think Egypt is a lovely country. It's populated by many wonderful people, and I have friends that are both immigrants and natives. I have visited the country again since the incident I'm going to tell you about, and I enjoyed my time there. Unfortunately, though, there's no avoiding the fact that attitudes to women in Egypt can be unpleasant. Things are a bit more relaxed in the country in 2025, but when this occurred in 2011, it could be extremely risky for a woman to walk around by herself, especially uncovered. A lot of Egyptian women wear hijabs or niqabs, covering their hair or almost everything apart from their eyes. Of course, Western non-Muslim women visiting Egypt just dress how they normally would, but this can be dangerous and downright stupid if you're alone. And as such, when I first visited Cairo, it was strongly advised that young women cover up as much as possible, make sure that they're with a male chaperone, and stick to the touristy areas. I was most excited about seeing the pyramids and exploring the deserts, and I wasn't even particularly thrilled about spending a few nights in central Cairo before we began our proper tour. Our tour guides insisted that it was totally worth it though, and we needed to experience the city to experience Egypt. As I followed the tour group through the bazaars, taking in the sights, the sounds, and the smells, I was starting to get won over. My dad was engaged in animated discussion with one of the guides, and they become fast friends. Mom just seemed happy to look at the rugs and ornaments for sale, and all the other middle-aged tourists were cooing and awing over the sights. I was the only young woman in her early 20s, and there was a guy my age on the tour group too, but he'd opted out of this afternoon's city tour due to food poisoning, which was really because he was hungover from the night before. Nobody was really paying attention to me, nor did I to them, which is why I didn't notice it first when I lost sight of the tour group. At first I didn't panic. They couldn't have gone far. But when I turned down the next alleyway and found myself in a crowd of unfamiliar Egyptian faces, it did cause me to pause. A few of the older male store owners were looking at me a little strangely, their eyes traveling up and down my body, even though I was wearing jeans and a long-sleeved t-shirt, the best compromise I could make in this heat. I got pulled along by the throng of the crowd, and before I knew it, I'd been kind of forced into another side of the alley, ducking out of the flow of people just so I could get my bearings. A few young men stood in a doorway, and I knew immediately that they were trouble. They sort of strutted over towards me in the way that certain guys do, and the way they studied my body made the previous store owners look reserved. They looked at me with a barely disguised hunger, and I swear to God, one of them even licked his lips. They started talking to each other in Arabic, and I couldn't understand what most of them had said, but recognized the word for cattle or cow and girl. One of them said something that caused the others to hoot and clap his buddy on the shoulders. I quickly apologized for disturbing them, which was a mistake. I shouldn't have acknowledged them or made eye contact. Before I could step back out of the alley, one of them grabbed me by the wrist and pulled me deeper into the shadows. My blood immediately ran cold. I knew exactly what they wanted to do to me and what the things that they were saying meant. One of them pinned my arms behind my back, while another one started to lift my t-shirt, running his fingers over my stomach. I felt sick and knew that this was it. If I didn't do something now, then this was going to be an event that would define the rest of my life, whether I wanted it to or not. I drew on all my self-defense training and slammed my body back into the guy holding my hands. He hit the wall with a thud, letting go of my wrists. Using the momentum, I kicked forwards at the guy who had been touching me, slamming his head backwards against the first guy's nose as I did so. I heard a crunch and a scream and quickly pulled free as two of the guys howled in pain. The third guy had been watching, but he was the one that started to chase. I had no idea where I was running to or how I could find safety. There was every chance that I'd just run into more angry young men who were looking to tear me apart. I can't even describe the chase because it was all some blur. All I know is that the man chasing me grabbed my hair and shirt at least a few times, including one where he tore a chunk of the hair out of my scalp, causing me to cry out in pain. It felt like I'd never escaped him. Everywhere I went, crowds were surging forward, and it was only later that I learned that I was on the outskirts of a goddamn armed riot. And I think that's what saved me. Eventually, I burst into a courtyard and saw my parents and the tour group. They all looked frantic and defensive, and I guess that's why our one tour guide who'd befriended my dad was holding a brick. He barely paused as I came sprinting into the courtyard, followed by a guy who was clearly chasing me. The tour guide pulled back his arm and let his brick fly straight and true. I heard it hit my pursuer's head with a loud, hollow clunk, and he just sort of dropped to the floor like a discarded sack of potatoes. The tour guide said it was better that we got out of here because something was clearly going down, so he and the other guide led us down some more side streets and away from what he explained was turning into a full-scale riot. I asked if we should tell the cops about the guys who tried to assault me, and he just sort of laughed. We made it back to the hotel, which was gated and had armed guards. The next day, it was time for the tour group to move on anyway, and we spent the rest of the vacation at a luxury resort near the pyramids, where we lounged by the pool, relaxed, and went on various day trips to ancient historic sites of interest. Now, I love Egypt, and like I say, I've been back there since, but this was the most terrifying experience I've ever had, and one that could have changed my life, all because some people see others as less than human. This is a story I tell my buds for a laugh sometimes, but I only laugh about it because otherwise you'd bloody cry, you know? Everything turned out okay, but honestly at the time, I thought my entire life was over, and I'd spent the rest of my days rotting in a Dutch jail. So it all started because me and a mate, Milo, got really into mopeds. We both got mopeds while we were still in school. While the rest of our friends were learning to drive cars, we smugly declared that our little scooters were the most cost-effective, sensible option, and anyone who pissed all their money into the tank of a 4-seater gas guzzler was a right chump. After school, we graduated from just having our CBT, a learner's permit for mopeds, to actually passing our motorcycle tests. We were living large, riding our mopeds around town like a lame British Macklemore, that song he did about mopeds, downtown, which was unironically our theme song if you want to picture exactly the kind of insufferable twats that we were back then. Now one day, Milo excitedly showed me a video that he'd found online, advertising a group moped trip from Poland to the Netherlands. I didn't quite understand the deal at first, but as I watched the video, it seemed like we'd go on a cross-continent moped tour with the group as part of a documentary they were filming. Not only would we get to embark on the trip of a lifetime, but it would cost us almost nothing. As long as we could get ourselves there, we'd be provided with room, board, and moped rental every step of the way. I was a bit sad to have to leave my beloved Vespa behind in the UK, but as for the rest, you could not sniff at that at all. Milo was incredibly enthusiastic about it too, and looking back, I didn't really have the time to pause and wonder if there was some kind of catch. And by the time my girlfriend Jane suggested it seemed too good to be true, I was already fully on board and committed to the idea, so I didn't really want to find any excuses to back out of the trip. I didn't do my due diligence and look into Pete, the guy organizing the tour. Milo said that he had though, and everything was totally on level, so hey, why wouldn't I believe my childhood best friend? We flew to Poland a couple of months later, and honestly I'd be lying if I said that the trip wasn't great. It was our first time going on a foreign holiday and we really relished it. The moped journey from Poland to the Netherlands was great fun, even if it took some getting used to riding a different machine, and me, Milo, and the 3 other guys and Pete all got on really well. After some days of fun, frolics, and breakneck moped driving, we pulled into the parking lot of the hotel we were going to be staying at in the Netherlands. Immediately, it was very obvious that this was a brothel, and I shot Milo a look. This is not what we'd agreed upon. Jane would certainly not be okay with me staying in a damn brothel. Luckily for Jane, she wouldn't have to worry about it. We parked up our mopeds outside, climbed off, and then suddenly, floodlights slammed on in the darkness, and loud voices were yelling. I didn't understand what was being said, but as a group of armed cops stormed into view, I understood the premise. Get down on the ground with your hands above your head. I complied, but I was almost laughing. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. There was no reason why I should be getting arrested by armed cops. My confidence remained as they forced open the seats of our mopeds and threw our stuff to the ground. Some changes of clothes I'd stashed under the seat, nothing of note. One of the officers yanked the backpack off my back and emptied the contents onto the ground. I watched in dawning horror as an armed cop snatched up my passport and pocketed it. Then another cop began slicing open the seats of the mopeds. That's when my confidence really dissipated. I stared open-mouthed as they pulled 2 duct tape packages out of the seat cushioning that I'd spent the last few days sitting on. I didn't have to ask to know what I'd been sitting on, though. Struggling to look around at Milo, who was being nailed on by a cop, the look on his face caused my heart to completely sink. The absolute imbecile was not at all surprised to see the drugs. My best friend had implicated me in a freaking cocaine smuggling operation without my knowledge. No wonder it had been too good to be true. No wonder Pete was such a nice guy. I had known Milo had a few dodgy contacts and dabbled in very light dealing back at home, but I had no idea he'd done anything like this. Protesting my innocence did not help, though, as I was dragged into a waiting paddy wagon and then booked and processed in a Dutch jail and thrown into a single cell where I had nothing to do but sit, fret, and poop myself in fear. Not literally. I'd never even been in trouble with the law before, and the idea that I could genuinely be going to prison, that I had actually committed a serious crime, even unwittingly. The next few days were a blur of terror and anxiety. I could not make an international call to let Jane know what was going on. I could not get a hold of Milo and wring that idiot's neck while demanding he explain things. All I could do was talk to a couple of Dutch cops who barely spoke English, but knew just enough to tell me that I was in a whole heap of trouble. In the end, it was Pete who proved to be my savior, even if he was the ringleader and the guy to blame in the first place. Milo clammed up, refusing to say anything in my defense, but in the end, Pete spilled everything and cut some kind of deal where he ratted out his suppliers. Part of the deal involved telling them that myself and 2 of the 3 other guys were just clueless patsies, brought along to drive the extra mopeds. Only Pete, Milo, and a 3rd guy, Jacob, were actually part of the drug smuggling. The day that a guy from the UK embassy came to visit me in my cell and told me I was going home, I genuinely fell to my knees and wept. I went home and hugged my mom and dad and had a bang-up Sunday roast. My homecoming to Jane wasn't quite so grand, though. I don't think she ever quite believed me that I wasn't involved in the criminal enterprise, and honestly, that really hurt. I'd never done anything to make her distrust me, and after 6 months of constant jibes and jokes about my complicity, I couldn't stand it anymore, and we actually ended up breaking up. Even though the Dutch law accepted that I had no knowledge of the drug smuggling, I was still deported and banned from entering the Netherlands for 10 years. That time's just up about now, and not sure why I'd ever want to go back though, unless for some reason I wanted to visit Milo, who's still serving 2 more years on his sentence. I have no sympathy for that idiot. Even after Pete spilled the beans, Milo pleaded not guilty and got a much longer sentence because of it. It's like the American Wesley Snipes said, "Some mother lovers always trying to drive a moped up a hill." Me and my missus are writing to you today to tell you about an absolutely messed up trip to the United Kingdom that we took a few years ago. It was just after COVID travel restrictions had been lifted, so we were itching to stretch our legs and visit a foreign country, so we picked somewhere as far away from home as possible. We didn't really have a plan for our UK holiday. It seemed like a nice place, so we opened up a map of Britain, stuck it on the dartboard at the bar that I co-own with my brother, and I threw a dart at it. Well, we missed, and I would have had to vacation in the Bristol Channel, so we threw another one and landed on Sussex. We didn't know anything about Sussex, and apparently it's not really a massive tourist destination, but we picked the funniest sounding place that also seemed a bit touristy, Bognor Regis. We figured if it was crap, it wouldn't be too hard to shoot up to London early, which we planned to do for the second half of the holiday regardless. Bognor Regis was actually great. We hit the town in July, dead in the middle of the Australian winter, and despite what we'd heard about the UK, the weather was bonzer. Me and the missus spent our days sunbathing on the beach, buying crap from the seafront stores and getting sunburnt. Then, at night, we hit the bars and the clubs and tried our best to paint the quiet seaside town red. We made a bunch of friends at Bognor Regis, other tourists from all over the world, like Detroit, Belgium, Turkey, Birmingham, all sorts. One fella that we met, he said his name was Rishi, like the then Prime Minister, which we all found really funny. Rishi was a wild party animal, and it was with Rishi that we got so drunk one night that we found ourselves lost in the middle of the countryside, unsure how to get back to Bognor Regis. Me and the missus were both absolutely wrecked, and we lost track of Rishi altogether. We were out in the middle of nowhere, with no idea how we'd even managed to get there. I have a vague memory of riding in a van with Rishi and some other guys drinking cheap beer, but now me and the missus were walking along a country road in the dark, singing God Save the Queen. Rest in peace, Liz. Eventually, we came across a 24-hour petrol station and a service station. There was a Costa Coffee, but it was closed, and a McDonald's staffed by a very bored-looking teenage boy. We bought some munchies and then wandered to the gas station to see if they had the number for a local taxi firm or some type of ride. The guy at the counter directed us to a notice board, which we struggled to read in our drunken state, but eventually found a business card from someone offering taxi services 24 hours a day. I called it up on my mobile, and a very polite young woman answered. I told her where we were at, described the service station, and she said that she knew exactly where to send a driver. She told us to look out for a silver Ford and that our driver would be named Mears. Half an hour later, a car pulled into the petrol station lot, and a shifty-looking bloke gestured us over. I asked if he was Mears, and he said, sure, why not? Now, looking back, I can't be sure if we got into the right car. It's hard to get it clear in my head whether I'm just remembering things wrong or whether we really were this careless with getting into a car with a stranger. Either way, Mears, or whoever this crooked bogan was, did not have our best interests at heart. It wasn't immediately obvious. We had no bloody clue where we were, so we had no bloody clue that Mears was driving us in the total opposite direction to Bognor Regis. And by now, my missus had passed out and was snoring against my shoulder. I tried to make conversation with Mears from the back seat, but he suddenly pretended that he couldn't speak English. Weird, I thought. He'd understood me perfectly earlier. Or maybe I'd been so drunk that I just sort of slurred nonsense at him and he just sort of gone along with it. When we pulled up to a stop, I knew we definitely weren't in Bognor Regis. We were in the courtyard of some broken-down, filthy farmhouse that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, I saw a chicken run across the dirt in the darkness and at least one goat peering at me eerily from beyond a fence. Lovely, I thought. Mears got out of the car and yelled something into the darkness. A dog began to bark furiously and a male voice called back. I peered through the front windscreen from the back seat, squinting into the darkness, and saw two fellas join Mears. Mears had his window down so I could hear them, even though I don't think he knew that I could hear them. Fear gripped me as I realized what they were talking about. Mears was saying that we were rich American tourists. We're Australians, you wanker, I wanted to yell, and that nobody knew where we were, so they could just do us over and dump us in the acid vats out back. Bloody Nora, I thought. I didn't much fancy that either. And neither did one of the men because he vehemently disagreed with Mears, slapping him around on the back of the head even. And at first I thought this meant Mears had been kidding around. But no, the other man said that they just wanted to do me in, but the missus should be handed over to Osama and his boys, and they'd know what to do with her. I swear on my old dad's grave, when I heard Osama, I thought that they were just larrikins. But then Mears said something like, sure, maybe they'll hook us up with some of their fine, and then a derogatory term that implied that he was talking about very young women. Next, I saw the glint of steel as one of the men unsheathed some huge blade. Right, this could totally ruck off. Machetes, grooming gangs, a matey called Osama? Not bloody likely. Not for me and the missus. And I didn't even think. Drunk as an absolute skunk, I clambered into the front of the Ford Escort. The Lord God above must have been looking out for me that night, because Mears the moron had left his freaking keys in the ignition. For a second, I thought I was going to have a classic horror movie moment where the engine wouldn't take over and the car wouldn't start. But nah, luck was on my side. I gunned the engine and drove straight forward, even clipping Mears in the leg as he dived out of the way. Somehow, despite being a terrible driver even when sober, I managed to pull off a perfect U-turn and then send the car squealing, crashing out of the gate of the farmyard and onto the darkened country roads. I pushed that battered old Ford Escort to its absolute peak, breaking the speed limit for a good 20 minutes, hoping and praying that I'd encountered the law so they could pull me over and I could tell them everything. Eventually, I remembered the missus in the back. The lucky bird had slept through the entire thing and only now just started stirring, muttering and asking where we were and then telling me to slow down. Eventually, we found our way to a little village which had a 24-hour Tesco. Both our phones had run out of battery at some point in the night, so we went inside, and I told the poor old dear on the checkout that we'd almost been kidnapped by a grooming gang and could we possibly borrow the phone. I'd sobered up quite a bit by now, and I imagined I was still a total mess, and the missus was still rat-arsed. Now, long story short, the cops came, they searched some farmhouses in the area that could match the description I gave, but they didn't find anyone. And the car that we'd acquired had stolen plates and had been reported stolen a few years before. The cops impounded it, and for all I know, it's still in some impound lot today. The name Mears was apparently the name of a local taxi driver and had not been the guy whose car we'd gotten into. They were able to verify that the real Mears showed up at the petrol station shortly after we got into the wrong Ford. The cops did confirm one chilling fact, though. Osama was the first name of a suspect in a grooming gang case in the area. Unfortunately, our testimony didn't really help anything with that case, but I hope to God they got him. Me and the missus got off pretty lightly, all told. I still have friends who to this day insist that I got so drunk I imagined this whole thing, but I have copies of the police reports as a souvenir from our time in Bognor Regis to prove it. And I can only wish total ill will upon the men who intended to kill us, especially fake Mears. I hope it hurt when I hit you with your own car, and if you ever come to Australia, I'll happily feed you to a kangaroo, you tosser. Back in the 2000s, I went on a girls' trip to Crete. For the most part, it was absolutely awesome, especially for a history nerd like me. I loved exploring all the ruins, taking in the local history, and hanging out on the beach. And unlike at home, it was totally fine to sunbathe topless, so my pale ass didn't have to end up with an awful tan line like I usually did on vacation. In theory, anyway. Of course, I was actually way too shy to do that, but it was nice to know that I could have if I wanted to. I mention this because it's irrelevant that I'm kind of a wallflower. I don't really like being the center of attention or doing any wild things. I'm not a party girl, never have been. At the time of this vacation, I was just out of college and I'd still never even been drunk. I drank a glass of wine or two with dinner, but that was the extent of it. I was much more at home among the ancient stones of Greece than I was in the clubs, even if that was the main purpose of this holiday. I was the sensible one of the group, the designated driver, the sober Sally, and I was okay with this. I'd still go out on the town with the other girls, but I'd be the one to head back to the hotel by 10 p.m. and then awake to see the sunrise. All this to say, when I went to some Cretan ruins with one of my friends, Nora, and we met a couple of local brothers who offered us something to drink, I made them swear on Zeus that it wasn't alcoholic. For one thing, it was early afternoon. For another, I wanted to keep a clear head on because I was planning on exploring some subterranean tunnels in the ruins, and they weren't entirely safe. We'd met the boys in the town the night before, and they had construction permits for the area, which wasn't entirely open to the public. They assured me that the bitter purple drink was a local recipe, a natural energy drink made from dandelions and other plants. At any other time, I would not accept strange drinks from strange men, but we were also accompanied by the brother's grandparents and a sweet and lovely old couple who also assured me that the drink was not alcoholic and would simply give me the energy and drive to explore the ruins. Obviously, it's clear from the setup that there was something wrong with the drink, but to this day I'm certain that the family didn't intend there to be anything wrong with it. They just didn't consider the fact that their beloved family recipe might require a bit of acclimatization for an American tourist who isn't used to drinking something that contains datura. For those who don't know, datura is a somewhat poisonous plant that can be used as a recreational hallucinogen. Later, the family told me that they only used a pinch of datura in their drink to give it a kick, but I barely even drank wine, let alone hallucinogens or poison. On top of that, I was unknowingly suffering from mild sunstroke. I'd spent all morning in the sun at the ruins, and I'd mostly only been drinking this bitter dandelion and datura juice, so I was sunstruck and absolutely dehydrated. All of this was a recipe for disaster when I went down into the tunnels under the ruins, armed only with a flashlight, and decided that I could absolutely manage it alone. It didn't take long for me to start panicking. It was cooler underground, but there were strange sounds. Soon I'd lost sight of any natural sunlight and only had my flashlight to guide me. I started sensing something was wrong soon after that. Whirls and chips in the rock began to form words and pictures in the darkness. I paused for 5 entire minutes, reading some ancient writing on the wall that suddenly turned back into meaningless rock texture. And next, I was certain that I could feel hot animal breath on my neck. I spun around, and of course nothing was there. Somehow, I got it into my mind that the ghost of a minotaur was down here with me, an invisible minotaur ghost, and I began to run down the corridors, as if that would somehow help if it was in fact a ghost. I ended up just getting myself more lost and then heard scraping and the skittering of small stones. I shone my flashlight down the corridor, and a small minotaur with a hairy face was standing there. At least, that's what I saw him as in my sunstroke-addled datura-brained state. The minotaur began to advance towards me, snorting and growling at me. A voice in the back of my mind was telling me that I was hallucinating. I couldn't possibly actually be seeing a minotaur. It was an invisible ghost minotaur after all. So I stood my ground and shone my flashlight at the creature and waited for it to pass through me and disappear. Instead, the minotaur reached out and grabbed me. Stinking foul wine breath washed over me as the beast bore down on me. And for some reason, the minotaur wore a filthy fisherman's coat and fishing pants too, and he had gumboots on and a beard and a knitted cap and was also an old man. Yeah, this wasn't a minotaur. It was a hobo lurking around in the ruins, and now he had his hands on me. My head was spinning, and colors were flashing around the tunnel like I was in a magic abyss. The hobo minotaur clacked his teeth at me and slobbered down his beard, and I felt him grabbing at the waistband of my pants. Hell no, buddy. I raised the flashlight up over my head and brought it down on his forehead with a crack. This caused this hobo minotaur to howl in enraged pain and let go of me, but it also caused the flashlight's beam to weaken quite considerably. I shoved the hobo roughly against a wall and ran past him, trying to follow the route that I was sure that I'd taken. And it was a chase sequence worthy of an actual slasher movie, not least because the hobo managed to grab me a couple of times and tear my shirt a bit. Thankfully, nothing revealing, and I would have been mortified, as we've already established. It was just enough to make me look kind of badass when I came running out of the tunnels, screaming that I was being chased by a freaking minotaur. And holy crap, someone call Olympus because there was an actual monster after me. Nora grabbed me and shook me and asked me what was really wrong. Nora had been drinking the datura drink too, but didn't seem to be affected by it in the same way I was, maybe because she was used to alcohol and also didn't have sunstroke. I tried to explain that there was a beast, but then the hobo came charging out of the tunnel screaming and yelling. Later, our Greek friends wouldn't translate exactly what he'd said, but told me that it was obscene. The hobo rushed at me and grabbed me, throwing me to the ground and flipping me over. Nora punched him and I kicked, squabbling backwards away from him as he reeled back. The Greek guys we were with came running over and one of them grabbed the hobo and threw him backwards. He stumbled across the area, hitting a pillar hard with his arm. Some debris dislodged from the top of the pillar and fell straight onto his shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. I heard an absolute sickening crunch of bone as the rock pinned him down, and for a moment, I almost felt bad for him, until I remembered what he'd clearly been trying to do to me in those tunnels. The elderly couple told the grandsons to take us back to our hotel, and that they'd call the cops and get the hobo arrested for trespassing. They said it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much I didn't... That said, it was better that we didn't let them know that we'd been in the ruins because we weren't strictly supposed to be there, and the Greek police can be a bit volatile. As much as I didn't want the hobo to get away with assaulting me, I was still very dizzy and confused from whatever was affecting me, and also judging from the state of the hobo and his crushed arm, he wouldn't be trying to assault anyone else anytime soon. I slept off the heat exhaustion and datura poisoning, and the next day we had a conversation with these Greek brothers in which we worked out that the datura in the cocktail was the likely culprit for my hallucinations, if you haven't already figured it out. And in some ways, I think their strange concoction actually helped. It gave me the energy to fight back against this hobo and escape through the tunnels, and maybe if I'd been faced with the dark reality of the situation down in those ruins, I might have fallen apart and been unable to escape. On the other hand, maybe if I wasn't high on datura and actually had heat stroke, I might not have gone into a labyrinth alone in the first place. But really, who can say? I've got a story about Canada that I want to share with you. My family and I are from Kentucky. There's me, my wife Ellie, my 20-year-old daughter, my 15-year-old son, and my 9-year-old daughter. We go on vacation to Europe most years, but last year we decided that it was finally time to get really exotic and head to Canada. We settled in a small village near the boreal forest and went about researching the perfect Airbnb to rent for a week of wilderness tranquility and enjoyment. My wife found the perfect place, very affordable too, and we booked it. A few months later, I headed up to Merry Canada with the fam in tow. My son Elijah spent the entire journey playing on his Switch and wouldn't pay attention to the beautiful natural countryside, but my wife and daughters were awestruck, and so was I. I hadn't been to Canada in many years and was bringing back a lot of fond memories. We arrived at the Airbnb, a stunning woodland property just off from the nearby village. The key was meant to be just inside this digital lockbox attached to the front of the house, but as we pulled up and got out, it was pretty clear that the box was hanging open. Great start. I tried the front door and it was locked, of course. Well, no problem. Thankfully, there was cell reception at the property, so I called up the number that we had for the owners, but no answer. Great again. Seconds later, we heard footsteps crunching under the driveway. An elderly couple waved to us and asked if we'd been calling them. They introduced themselves as the owners of the property and apologized if they were running late. They had the key with them and they could let us right on in. They were an odd-looking pair, I guess. The husband introduced himself as an ex-cop in his 70s, and he reminded me of one of the sort of Weeble toys from when I was a kid. Weeble wobbles, but won't fall down, you know the ones? He was completely hairless, like shiny bald and free of eyebrows, but he had a huge bushy beard that I kept staring at because I was certain it was a wig. Is that what you call a fake beard? To this day, I don't even know, and the icing on the cake was his name. He said his name was Gerald Garibaldi, and I began to laugh when he said this, but my wife kind of elbowed me, and Gerald Garibaldi looked slightly excited, as if he had no idea what the joke was. And the wife introduced herself as Maureen Garibaldi, and the hair on her face wasn't a wig. It was unfortunate, but Maureen Garibaldi had a few thick whiskers sprouting from her chin and a very prominent female mustache that looked like it hadn't been waxed since pretty much ever. Not that she had any obligation to actually wax, of course, but needless to say that they were a very odd-looking couple. My eldest, Cindy, and Elliot were elbowing each other, sort of whispering and laughing, and it was all I could do to keep a straight face when my youngest, Amy, kept asking what was so funny. Maureen was in her 60s and wore a flowery summer dress that was kind of obscenely short. She had long white socks on and those black shiny shoes that honest to God schoolgirls wear, and I'm ashamed to say that the pair of them kind of unsettled me. Gerald and Maureen Garibaldi led us into the house and then very kindly gave us a tour that somehow managed to last nearly 2 hours. Then, they very kindly helped us bring our luggage in from the car, and then kindly helped us unpack the kitchen things and food and other essentials, and then kindly sat there like eager puppies, clearly waiting for us to invite them to stay for dinner. It was the first night of our freaking vacation, though, and I really didn't want those weirdos encroaching on our family time, but hey, what could I do? They were very kind. And that phrase became a running joke because the Garibaldis continuously told us that we were very kind for this and that thing. Over dinner, Gerald Garibaldi talked and talked and talked, and the rest of us could just do nothing but listen. And the crazy thing is, I couldn't really tell you what he talked about. He just rambled about nothing and everything. Politics, movies, music, Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, cancel culture, the youth of today, animated violence, and those damn video games, all sorts of stuff. But I could not tell you a single thing he actually said or a single opinion he actually had. It was like the man was talking total gibberish, just saying snippets of things that made some sense or could pertain to something, but just didn't really fit together in any cohesive manner. And at one point he was talking about how Trump was the worst thing to happen to the country in years, but then 5 seconds later he was calling him the greatest damn president the country's ever seen. He kept bringing up Angela Merkel too, saying what an ugly troll she was, and Ellie and I fought to keep a straight face because I swear up and down Maureen Garibaldi could have been Angela Merkel's long-lost twin, separated at birth. Now imagine Angela Merkel dressed like a Lolita, I was told, and deepest apologies for the image, but that was Maureen Garibaldi, and don't ask me how I know any of that stuff. They were honestly like something from that weird show on TLC. I genuinely wanted to look around for hidden cameras. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Surely we were being pranked. Unfortunately, things didn't stay comical for very long. After dinner, the Garibaldis made themselves comfortable in the living room and turned the TV on. I took Ellie into the other room and asked her what the hell we were going to do. Amy was almost crying because she wanted to play board games, and Elliot and Cindy had already left to explore the outskirts of the forest before the sun had fully set. In the end, I had to very politely ask the Garibaldis if they would mind leaving for the night and letting us settle in. I expected them to display that Canadian embarrassment and a sort of aw shucks energy, but instead, Gerald Garibaldi decided to square up to me. He pushed me in the chest and accused me of being an ungrateful guest. They had allowed us into their abode, after all, and how dare we simply ask them to leave? What right did I have to try and throw a man out of his own home, especially after dinner? It started to dawn on me that these freaks did not realize how Airbnb was supposed to work. I mean, surely they realized that they were meant to leave the house while we stayed in it. And I gently tried to ask this, and they acted furious. Again, I almost thought that we were being pranked. Maybe this was one of those dumb YouTube things. But then Maureen began outright howling and crying and accusing us of being home invaders. I could not believe what I was hearing. When she threw some pretty vile slurs at Ellie, that's when I knew that this was definitely not a joke. I drew the line there. This had been funny for an evening, but it was beginning to ruin our much-needed vacation. And moreover, they were upsetting Amy, and nobody speaks to my wife like that. I have no idea, but demand that this couple leave their own property or I'd call the police. I wasn't even sure if this could fly legally, but what choice did I have? I could put a complaint in the Airbnb the next day, and if we had to find a nice hotel in the town over, then that would suck, but so be it. Surprisingly, the Garibaldis seemed terrified at the idea of me calling the cops. They heaved their considerable bulks off the couch and stormed out. Now I watched them leave, stamping their way around the outside of the house and into the forest. Now minutes later, Elliot came back in. I filled him in on what he'd missed and told him that the Garibaldis were unhinged and not to let them in if they came back. Elliot agreed and then asked where Cindy was. My heart sank. I thought she'd been with him. Elliot said she had been, but that she'd headed back to the house ahead of him because she needed to use the bathroom. Ellie was upstairs putting Amy to bed, so Elliot and I rushed outside to try and find Cindy. She was in a clearing with the Garibaldis. As I approached, I saw that Maureen was holding a damn shovel. As I got closer, I could hear what Gerald was saying. He was trying to persuade my 20-year-old daughter to come back with them to their house and have some sexy times with them. Cindy, who hadn't been present during the blow-up, was doing her best to be nice and not offend them, and I'm so proud of her for that. She was clearly worried about the shovel Maureen was holding, though, despite not knowing how volatile and weird this couple really was. I snuck out behind Maureen and grabbed the shovel from her hands. I told Cindy to get behind me, and that she didn't have to put up with this crap from these utter freaks. Maureen screamed at me, telling me that my family wasn't safe, and that they'd booby-trapped the house, and that there was a carbon monoxide leak that would poison us all in our sleep, and that they'd rigged the house to kill us. It was absolutely insane. I had no idea what we could do. There was no way that we could stay overnight in that house when the owners were this nuts. For the moment, I told Cindy to take Elliot back into the house. Then I kind of threatened the Garibaldis with a shovel, making sure they backed off and left the property. Once I was sure they waddled far enough away, I went back into the house. Inside, Ellie met me with some incredibly bizarre news. While I'd been out there dealing with the Garibaldis, she'd received a phone call on the Airbnb's landline. It was the owners, asking if we'd arrived okay and calling to wish us a pleasant stay. Of course, Ellie had told them that we'd spent an evening with the supposed owners, and my wife described the couple who'd intruded on our Canadian vacation. The actual owners, the McAvoys, told us to keep the door locked and that they'd be over with law enforcement shortly. Now, sure enough, 10 minutes later, a station wagon and a police cruiser pulled into the driveway, and that's how we met the real and very lovely owners of that Airbnb. There's a simple, if crazy, explanation for what had happened. The Garibaldis, which was not their real name, of course, were the neighbors of the McAvoys who'd been enraged on a land boundary dispute with them for years. They'd always been quietly resentful of the McAvoys, and always been an annoying but minor thorn in their side. When the McAvoys bought a second property on the other side of the Garibaldis' land, it all became too much for them, and they decided to try and sabotage the McAvoys' attempts at earning income through Airbnb by masquerading as the owners, the lunatic Garibaldis, to scare away any guests. Turns out, we were the first guests, and the Garibaldis' bizarre, grudge-driven plan almost worked. The utter weirdos had even managed to spy on the McAvoys to see the keypad code for the electronic lock and help themselves to the key. Unfortunately, that was the only real crime they'd committed, and even then it was their word against the McAvoys that they hadn't actually been told the key code. However, the Garibaldis, whose real names I won't use just in case, were known as menaces and troublemakers to local law enforcement, who were only too happy to put the scares on them enough that we had a mostly peaceful stay for the rest of our vacation. Which, I will add, the McAvoys gave us a severe discount on, meaning that for the most part, we got to spend a beautiful, tranquil vacation on the outskirts of the boreal forest for half the normal asking price. I say for the most part because there was one final scary incident before we left. On the day we were packing up to head out, after having had a great time, I was downstairs with Cindy packing up the kitchen. We heard a crash from the living room and ran next door to see that a stone had been hurled through the windows, smeared with what I can only hope was mud. We rushed outside to see a fat figure disappearing into the trees. I let the McAvoys know, and they informed the cops. I really hope for their sake that they installed some home security going forward. I do keep an eye on the Airbnb website to see if that property has ever been made available to vacationers again, and I've not seen it crop up since. It could be that the McAvoys decided that it wasn't worth trying to combat the Garibaldis, or it could just be that they're not renting through Airbnb anymore. Either way, I wish the McAvoys all the best. As for the bizarre, creepy couple, if you've ever come near my family again, I'll show you us US folk aren't quite as forgiving as our Canadian cousins. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button here on YouTube to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, Hello Kitty is for babies.